So I'm going to be talking about the survey that we performed as part of the UrGEnT study. So the aims of this presentation is I've got 20 minutes and too many slides, but hopefully all will be well. A bit of a background to the actual survey, a very brief description of the methods, and to share some key results and some implications. And just to say, for this session and the next presentation, which will be Jerry talking about some of the focus groups, we won't take any questions, but then we've got scheduled a half-an-hour panel where we're going to ask the study team to come up, and we've even got chairs ready. And we'll take questions and have a bit of discussion about this and the focus group data. So the aims of the study, there were two aims. One was to explore some of the experiences of people from minority groups in undergraduate or pre-registration training in osteopathic educational settings. The other was to look at this notion of cultural humility. Now, I've just put this up. I know it's a very, very busy slide. And if you're the type of person who has to read slides, go ahead. It's just doing the distinction. There's a lot in the literature about cultural competence. And we moved away from that because some more contemporary thinking talks about cultural humility. And some of the criticisms around cultural competence are that it's the idea that you can become competent in other people's cultures and you can own it. And it's kind of got some patriarchal kind of roots of ownership and maybe over optimistic. And certainly when you think about the diversity and if you think about intersectionality, the hope that, say, in a university setting, that you could somehow teach people to be culturally competent, given all that heterogeneity and variation and the like, it's very unlikely that's going to happen. So we went for cultural humility as a context, which is much more of a disposition. And the dimensions, and these are the factors. So when you have subscales in a questionnaire, they're factors or dimensions or concepts that a questionnaire claims to measure. And in our survey, the instrument we used tried to measure these concepts. Actually, it's a well-validated scale, but it's only been validated and used in counselling psychotherapy contexts, and it's a relatively new instrument that we used. And those dimensions are the notion of your disposition to being open, being self-aware, being egoless, being willing to support interactions and being less willing to take the expert role, being open to the expertise of the other, and being self-reflective and being critically reflective of self. So again, don't bother reading these slides. This is the example of the multidimensional cultural humility scale. And I just thought I'd pull out a couple of items. What we did, because the scale was for preclinical and clinical students. So for preclinical students, we changed it a bit. It said, I anticipate as a dispositional phrase. For clinical students, it was the same, but we said patient instead of client because it had come from a client-based kind of culture. And you can see items there about openness, self-awareness. I'm known by colleagues seek advice. Egoless. I ask my patients about their cultural perspectives. Supportive interaction. These are involved. They're reverse coded. I wait for others to ask about my biases for me to discuss them, etc. Self-reflection and critique. I enjoy learning from my weakness, which is kind of reflective practice items. Now, additionally to on the survey, so as well as measuring cultural humility in preclinical and clinical students, we asked them what they thought about the topic. Is this important or not? We asked them if they thought they had skills for asking patients about their backgrounds and experiences. And we asked about whether they thought the clinical environment was supportive of this kind of way of working. And the last bits of the survey, we asked about demographics and personal characteristics, experiences of education in a number of ways that will become clear when I report selected results. So the way we disseminated it, the survey, was we asked partners, people we knew, leaders in institutions across osteopathic education providers, and we shared with them a link to the survey, and we asked We did it once, then we did a reminder and another reminder, and this was all done about springtime last year. There's some detail about, because Kevin is our statistician, here I've put the details about imputation there because I knew he'd be coming, and tell me if I didn't. So results, I don't know, I'm not quite sure where I sit on this. Yeah, I suppose I was a bit disappointed that we got 202 in total, which may be about 20% response rate. There's obviously quite a bit of missing data in there as well. And actually, without paying HESA, which are the people who collect data for higher education, lots of money, oddly enough, we can't find out exactly how many students there were registered doing osteopathic programs at the time without going to individual institutions. We might try and have a go at that for the actual write-up for the papers. So this is blinded. You can see there's a bit of a skew here with one institution providing more respondents, 1 and 2 institutions providing more respondents, but there's coverage from 8 institutions providing responses. Again, this is one of the difficulties here is with the best will in the world, you start a survey off with high resolution, capturing the full range of ways that people can identify. And then you come to the data and you've got 1 or 2 here and 2 or 3 there, and you end up collapsing the data. So I've got a little disclaimer that although this is about inclusiveness today, I'm afraid what I've done with the analysis, what we've done with the analysis, we have collapsed categories down. And it does mean there is some unfortunate language in describing some of these data, which no doubt people will spot. But essentially, in terms of the proportions of folks, we had a larger than we might expect number of women responding, mostly white, mostly without disability, mostly identifying as heterosexual, and mostly identifying as not having a religion. So in terms of underrepresented groups, you can see here that people are, interestingly, given the context of data, if this is a very little, somewhat greater extent, there's a bigger actual proportion of people who are saying that they belong to an underrepresented group in the responses to the survey. So again, we've got folks who are identifying in some way, at least to some extent, quite a number of people in this survey as belonging to an underrepresented group. Now, this is in response to people who responded, how often they think they're being treated differently during their training based on their cultural background. And you can see there's quite a chunk there of people who are either unsure or saying yes. Now, if we look at this notion of treated differently, these are kind of some of the things that people put in the free text. I've just selected some of them, and I'll leave you a moment just to glance at those. Unsurprisingly, some of these data reflect the talks from Dr. Smith and Dr. Draper-Roddy, who we heard earlier. What you see that, that bit about non-Britishness coming through quite a bit, about xenophobia possibly, but also recognition that there are other dimensions other than the protected characteristics we're talking about, and one that's common in the literature is socio-economic status. How if one group of students, well, my son went off to Durham, and a reading week, there would be a gang of students, off skiing for the reading week, and there'll be another gang of students thinking, actually, I made it to Durham, but I come from a single parent family, and now I've left home. Not all of my siblings are sharing rooms. I can't go home anymore. I couldn't afford to go home anyway. Socioeconomic diversity is also an important thing in education. So I hope that gives you a flavour. We also we did some inferential testing, some stats, given the limited data set. Kevin worked very hard on these. So this is looking at the identification as belonging to an underrepresented group in osteopathic education. So it's kind of trying to unpick the people who identify themselves as being part of an underrepresented group. And so you can see there's a significant association there, statistically significant association between people identifying in terms of ethnicity. Again, here are some collapsed groups here. So you'll see the awkwardness of non-white is ethnicity in this instance. People identify as being other than white ethnicity is associated with self-identification as being an underrepresented group. Disability and sexual orientation, again, other than heterosexual, is that collection. Whereas religion, birth, sex, and gender identification is not. Another set of chi-squares, when I was going over these slides with my partner, she said, all these stats and slides, really? And then my statistician was very upset when I mentioned this. And the compromise was putting the meaning in big blue boxes or big boxes. Read that bit if you don't like the stats. Interestingly here, in terms of association between demographic characteristics, how people identify demographically, and reports of being treated differently, there was not an association between any particular group. Now, when we ask some of the questions about, and this again feeds back to what was said earlier today, we asked people who treated you differently. And I think what's kind of interesting here is that you've got academic staff. I mean, these are low numbers, admittedly, but academic class, clinical educator staff, administration staff, and colleagues. And sort of these 7, 8s, and 7s suggest that obvious areas to think about in terms of supporting and changing and training and developing would be those groups. There was some chat about this, and it's so exciting to have some data about some of the questions from this morning. Do people report to institutions when they've had a problem? Well, you can see that, I mean, those are overall percentages. Of those people we've got there, that kind of 15 people who had an issue, concern, didn't report, and only 3 did. Then we asked them, where do you report? Do you know where to report? And just what was said a bit earlier, people don't know where to report and how to do it. So there's a clear marker potentially for action, that people wouldn't know where and how. Big proportion don't know where. Okay, this was probably the slide that sparked a concern from my partner, and even Professor Carnes is turning her head to one side. So let me explain this to you. I'll go back here. Do you remember those dimensions we talked about? Humility. These are the dimensions. It's openness, self-awareness, egoless, self-reflection, sportive interactions. And over there is the scale as a whole. What we've got here is medians, middle of the data, and a range, half the data around it. Doesn't really matter. Just look at those medians you can see. This side here is the preclinical lot. Yeah. And the obvious thing, all you need to do is look at this slide, look at that slide, and go, are they different? So are the preclinicals different to the people who've got clinical training in terms of values? Eyeballs. No, they're not. No, they're not. And when we test this we test the means for the whole scale with significance testing. Indeed, that's absolutely right. They're not significantly different. You know, somehow that was a surprise for me from the data. You'd think exposure to training, exposure to communication skills, exposure to the values we inculcate in training, you'd expect maybe the people who are in the clinical phase to score more highly, but they don't. But then having said that, there are other surprises in medical education, like the fact that empathy scores decrease with exposure to education. You know, that's another counterintuitive one. Don't know what's going on there, but it shows to me that there's maybe scope for change there. Okay, here's another. Oh, the Vice Chancellor's screwed up his face at that slide. Oh, it's a worry. So this is basically a correlation slide. Remember, correlations looks at the relationship between 2 variables. On the bottom here, we've got an agreement scale between 1 being low and strongly agree being high. And this is a line of fit across the data here. And the 2 variables are the score, the total score on the humility scale, going up here, And this is agreement about whether the topic's important to me or not. Yeah. So if you think it's important, you score it over there. Is this topic important? You score it over there. If you score highly on the cultural humility scale, you'll be up here. And on this guy, the line is the line of correlation, the relationship maps, and there's confidence intervals for those who are static. And helpfully, all the black dots are the scores of individual pupils. Just a couple of observations about this. This is a significant but modest correlation between these things. But what you can see is there are some folks here who score, I'm not quite sure how this person managed to score quite so low on the cultural humility scale. But one wonders the profile of that individual and thinking about risk and how we could support them to engage more widely. If they're not interested potentially and score very low on the scale, you think, there's a potential risk there for engagement with maybe patients and colleagues. And up here, you can see most people scored fairly highly on the scale and scored fairly highly on this being important. Same two slides, same theories, so I won't explain the ideas again. Just to say there's a modest relationship between people's self-rating of skills. I've got the skills, global skills, to explore people's backgrounds, relationships, etc., and experiences in this context. There's a small correlation between that and the humility scale score. You can see that there. And there's no relationship. This was an interesting one. There's no relationship between perceptions of the clinical education environment. So my educational environment, the item, clinical environment in my institution is appropriate to support asking about patients' backgrounds and experiences. Yeah. So there's no relationship to the perception of the clinic environment and the score on the humility scale. We did test the difference between preclinical and clinical. Wasn't significant on the score on this, but interestingly, the preclinical students rate their clinical environment more highly as being appropriate to ask about patients than the people who actually have spent time in the clinic. But it wasn't significant, so I probably shouldn't have said that, to be fair. So just escalating the analysis and joy, and this is great for some of the students I can see in the room who I've been teaching some of this stuff to. What you've got here is this is a kind of regression, really looking at the factors that predict scoring on the humility scale. Okay, so we're trying to say, are there any interesting things going on here that predict scoring on the humility scale? And it's a bit peculiar, some of the data. The line in the middle here is the no effect line. Anything kind of red and over to the left is it predicts a decline, a negative, a lower score on the humility scale. And everything on the right is to do with a higher score. And so what you can see from these data, and the dots for those who care, the dot is the center of the data. I think it's the mean, isn't it? It's the mean of data, and the lines are confidence intervals either side. All my students here will know what confidence intervals are. You'll see there's quite some wide confidence intervals up there. That normally represents small sample size. In terms of significance, identifying these all reference to a particular gender. So reference, in this instance, reference to identifying as a woman. So if you identify as other, that predicts a higher cultural humility scale score. If you identify as non-heterosexual, again, because of the numbers, we had to collapse the data into a dichotomy. That again predicts a higher score. And then peculiarly, we don't really understand, maybe in the panel we could discuss this, identifying as having a disability predicts a lower score on the cultural humility scale. Perfect timing, I got the 3-minute sign. There are some limitations with this data. It's the first time round. It's unclear how representative the sample is. We can't be sure about systematic bias. In fact, actually, I'm pretty sure there is systematic bias in these data because we think it's not representative by OEI and or by sex. So there's some low numbers leading to low certainty with some of these estimates. Some of the categories were collapsed, so we lose resolution. But of course, if we had more numbers, we'd have higher resolution. And it's a new instrument adapted to osteopathy, which needs more research to figure out what's meaningful. But as a ballpark score, I think it's useful first time round. We did try and check the structure, but there wasn't sufficient data to do that effectively, although we did try. So what are the implications from these data? What can we draw, given those caveats? So given that there was no change in scores preclinical and clinical, and that some of the items we had was a didn't cross my mind item for students, it's clear there are some opportunities to develop skills and knowledge. And one would think exposure to the curriculum would develop skills. We need to enhance awareness and signposting as to how to alert institution when problems arise, which was said in the keynote before. Clearly, lots of people don't know where to go and how to do it. The dimensions of the scale focus on cultural aspects. But actually, I mean, thinking about some of the work the regulation osteopathy has done about shared decision-making and person-centered care and expectations around materiality to the individual with consent as practitioners, it's clear this stuff is really important. And then, you know, if we take it outside of the cultural identity and about minority groups, clearly these are core skills that are being tapped in this measure that it's reasonable for clinicians to want. Well, I'd say it's reasonable for humans to want, but reasonable to clinicians to have. In the future, we need bigger numbers and more involvement from students. So I'd like discussions, if we can, to do this annually, to build it again, even as an intervention to build awareness and build action. That would be great. So we have got some colleagues here from other institutions around the country. So next time round, if you're finding this interesting, let's promote the hell out of this and find a way we can find a little window where the poor students are not getting 10 other, how was your course today and how was your module and what do you think of the food? You know, if we can find a window where we can protect some time to get this survey in. And of course, there are opportunities to do a cohort study, which would follow people from inception forward and look at their development, which is different to doing a cross-sectional survey. I think that's about it. Yeah, I think that's it. Oh, yeah, more of that other stuff if we need it later. Thank you very much for your attention, everybody.